Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be with you all today. So this is a synopsis of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give a bit of context and background, and then talk a bit about head injury in prisoners in Scotland, talk a little about head injury in criminal justice social work, and then to talk about training and education. So let's start off with some context and talk about the programme on head injury in Scotland and why head injury is relevant. So the Cabinet Secretary for Justice in Scotland asked for a working party report on brain injury and offending in 2015. And I chaired that working party, and we produced the report the following year. And by and large, we made the report as evidence-based as we could. We did get some new evidence and took account of existing evidence at the time. But our recommendations included getting some more evidence about head injury and offending in Scotland, and to develop education and training, two things that I've been involved with since then. So in terms of evidence-based practice, what we've done is we've looked at representative samples of prisoners in 3 studies in men, women, and young men. And we've looked at hospital attendance with head injury of everyone who was in prison on a particular day in Scotland. We've looked at police custody. We've looked at attendees for social work, pre-sentencing reports. And we have done some work on education of prisoners about head injury and knowledge and training needs of professionals. So why is head injury relevant? Well, the prevalence is very high in people who are involved in the criminal justice system, and it's associated with crime and with recidivism. Disability, as you'll all know, is often hidden in head injury generally, particularly hidden, I think, in people in the criminal justice system. Staff and people with head injury aren't aware of the effects very often. It's also linked with other health problems, and it's associated with the risk of further brain injury. So what about the case in principle? Why might it be that head injury might be linked to offending? Now, I should just say that I've worked as a clinical academic for more than 40 years. So I work clinically with people with head injury. It's my area of interest. And most of the people I work with, a history of offending hasn't been something that's been paramount on the list of things that we've had to deal with. But there is a grouping of people where it is an issue. Why might that be in principle? Well, if you look at theories of offending, you find that a core element of many of these theories is impaired self-control. So these are theories of offending generally, not theories of offending linked to head injury, theories of offending. And the idea is that people who have a tendency to act on impulse, be aggressive, and not care about consequences for others are more likely to commit antisocial acts. But as we know, these are also effects of head injury. So in principle, it might be that head injury will increase the risk of offending in some people. And you'll be aware of emotional effects of head injury and cognitive effects in head injury. The emotional effects, people can be more impulsive. Their threshold for being aggressive can be reduced, can tend to think about things that revolve around themselves, and for some, not to be necessarily very concerned about the consequences of what they do. Thinking can be rigid. People can start on a course of action and continue with it despite getting feedback that it's antisocial or it's not working, and see things in black and white. And this, together with other cognitive problems, may make it more likely that people will commit antisocial acts. So that's the case in principle. But how common is head injury in practice in people who offend? So the studies we carried out in prisons, we assessed individually 500 men, women, and young males. And in each of these groupings, they were representative of the prison population in Scotland, meaning that we can perhaps generalize to the prison population with some confidence. In each study, about 80% of the sample had a history of head injury that's likely to have significant long-term effects. And our census of all prisoners in Scotland, so everyone in Scotland on a particular day, found that hospitalisation with head injury was more than twice as likely in the prisoner population than in a sample of the general population, who we'd matched for age and also for deprivation to take some account of background. So it's very common. And is there evidence that history of head injury is linked to offending? It's difficult to establish clear cause and effect, but prisoners with significant head injury in our studies had spent more time in prison. They had more convictions with prisoners without a history of head injury. Adults in prison with significant head injury were 3 to 5 times more likely to have convictions for violence than prisoners without such a history. When we look at some evidence from elsewhere, we can see that offending is more likely in population studies. If you look at a population and you look at their history of convictions, you find that if they've had a history of head injury, it's more likely they've got a conviction. If you refine that down even further and look at siblings, one's had a head injury and one hasn't in these population studies, it's more likely that the siblings with head injuries have been convicted of crime. And that's interesting because that gives you more of a control for environment and even for any potential genetic factors. So is head injury much the same in prisoners as in the general public? So the answer is no. It differs in these ways. Prevalence we've already talked about, it's much higher. And we'll look at these other factors: cause, lifetime history and disability, hospital attendance, and other problems. So in the general public, the most common cause in Scotland, and in fact in the UK, is a fall. That's the most common cause of head injury. In prisoners, it's assault. In adults and young men, this often arises during fighting, and in women, it results most commonly from domestic abuse. If we look at lifetime history and hospital attendance, what we find is that almost all the prisoners who had head injuries had suffered mild head injuries, and mostly they had brief or no loss of consciousness. About a third of the adults had moderate to severe head injury with loss of consciousness for more than 30 minutes. But an important difference here from the general population is 2/3 of those had mild head injury that was repeated over long periods of time, often associated with gang fighting, involvement with drugs in men, and with domestic abuse in women. Repeated head injury can have cumulative effects over time, as you probably know, and you'll be aware of worries about this in sport currently, in rugby, with people being taken off if they had a knock on the head for an assessment and so on. We found that disability was associated with head injury in a third of the adults with head injury, and it's mostly related to social function. So again, in a way that in some ways could appear somewhat subtle, making the disability somewhat hidden. By and large, people didn't have physical disability. Despite the high occurrence of many head injuries, 38% had never been to hospital. And bearing in mind that 2/3 of these people had repeated head injuries, had a history of many head injuries, and almost 40% had never attended the hospital, which means they wouldn't be getting any professional input or information about head injury or its effects. So when we turn to other health problems, I call this the weave of multimorbidity. And we know that people in prison have high levels of health morbidity, particularly related to drugs and alcohol use and mental health. They often have a history of trauma and abuse, repeated exposure to head injury, deprived backgrounds, and limited attendance at school, and special learning needs. And the strands of this weave interact with each other, and they need to be considered together. So let's look at head injury as a strand in this weave. In our studies, more than 80% of the prisoners had a problem with alcohol and drug use. Mental health problems were very common, especially stress-related problems, clinical anxiety and depression. Most reported a history of abuse and trauma. 2/3 of the women reported a chronic physical health condition. And so when we look at this kind of idea of the weave of multimorbidity, what you can see is that people who are involved in the criminal justice system often have a life history of challenge. It can begin early in life. There can be issues with parenting, education, and adversity, being brought up in an environment which is a deprived environment, where they may have peers and role models that aren't very positive in terms of providing them with a socialized experience. They may have limited employment opportunities. And the environment they're living in is associated with risk of trauma, physical and emotional trauma, and head injury. And of course, there's the development of poor diet, substance use, and exercise, which further exacerbates these difficulties. So it's important, really, in terms of seeing a head injury as a strand in this weave, is seeing the ways in which it interacts with these other factors, the need for holistic intervention, management, and support that carries through from prison, perhaps, to the community, the need for interagency work, but importantly to note some differences in risk and health problems in men, women, and young people. And they need to be accounted for when planning. And what our research shows is that if you're a prisoner in Scotland with a history of significant head injury, compared to prisoners without head injury, you're even more likely to have a history of psychological trauma, mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, and drug and alcohol problems. So all of these problems are rife in prisoners, but if you've got head injury, you're even more likely to have these problems. And you're more likely to have these further head injuries in the future. So let's just take an example quickly of trauma in women prisoners. What you can see here in the columns are causes of trauma in the first column, how common that is, the proportion of people in our sample, over 100 women, which represented more than 1/3 of all women in prison in Scotland, the proportion of them that had this history. The age of onset, which of course is young in people with child trauma, but still pretty young in the other categories also. The duration of the event is long. These are periods of time during which people are suffering this trauma. So you can see for domestic abuse there, 7-year periods was the median, and some women would have several periods of this. The final column I've left blank for a second, head injury. Did head injury occur during a traumatic event? If so, how common was that? You can see that more often than not, head injury occurred during abuse. PTSD was twice as likely in women with head injury. And if you look at the domestic abuse line there, you'll see that almost 80% of the women who had suffered from domestic abuse had also suffered repeated head injury during that time. I asked research workers for their perceptions of the women that they'd interviewed in terms of this, and they would say for most of the women, physical abuse had been part of their lives since early childhood. It was just seen as normal. Sadly, most were so used to being hit that they'd normalized this and they weren't aware of the potential cumulative effects of head injury, so they didn't even know they should ask for help. So this is really an issue, but people involved in the criminal justice system not understanding the impact of head injury, not knowing to ask for help, and often not having had any offers of help. So I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about head injury in criminal justice social work. We did a little study on this, looking at people who, with head injury, who'd been referred for a court report prior to sentencing. And the structured interviews showed that 3/4 had a lifetime history of significant head injury. So similar proportion to the adults in prison. Mental health and substance use problems are very common, and disability from brain injury in almost 40% of them. Despite this, no criminal justice social work report noted the history of head injury. So it highlights a need for training about head injury for criminal justice social work, the need to establish links with community brain injury services, and for there to be consideration of issues that are relevant in court proceedings and subsequently in relation to head injury and ways that it might affect the court process. So for criminal justice social workers, it's important, for example, for them to consider whether the person has had a history of head injury in the past few days. What are the effects? Are they still in post-traumatic amnesia, which, as you know, is a confusional state that can last for a very short time or for quite a long time after a head injury, depending how severe it is. Do they have a history of repeat mild head injuries, like they're having persisting effects? Do they have a history of head injury that's caused severe brain damage? Might they benefit from neurorehab? Bearing in mind that a significant proportion either don't go to hospital, or in my experience, they will often self-discharge before neurorehabilitation can be arranged. What support do they need? So you might think, well, wait a minute, how common is it for people to go to police custody and have had a head injury recently? So we did an observational pilot study in police custody in Glasgow, and also we have some national data on VRA's vulnerability risk assessment. So in police custody, they carry that out on everyone who goes through there to look at potential health-related risks of the person. And in Scotland, it's estimated under the observational study that about 13% of detainees report having had head injury in the past 48 hours. So that's a significant number. That equates to 12 to 14,000 people a year in Scotland. And so in England and Wales, that'd be 10 times that number. Now, many of these people who have had a head injury doesn't necessarily imply they've had a significant brain injury. It could be a cut to the head, or it could be they've had a brain injury that's fairly mild, which they might recover from fairly quickly, but it needs to be considered. Now, I knew when I got to this point, I wouldn't really have time to go through the detail on this slide, but it's important, for example, that criminal justice social workers can get involved in transition from prison to community, and the ways in which they can do that and organise support, and once people are in the community. And there are some particular issues for people who have been involved in the criminal justice system that are important. So I really just wanted to just spend a minute or two now at the end just to talk about training and education, because you might think, well, it's fine you're talking about all this, but what are you actually doing about it? Well, a kind of significant strategy here is to be developing training and education. So I've developed 4 training modules with NHS Education Scotland to provide training for the NHS in Scotland. It'll be on their online system. It's in production now. It should be completed, I hope, within the next few months. And so it will take people through an introduction to head injury in the criminal justice system, theoretical perspectives, evidence on head injury and crime, how to assess head injury, and then management and intervention. And in addition, Police Scotland have an interest in having a very slimmed down version to train police officers, particularly police officers involved in police custody. And Social Work Scotland can access this system in TURAS, may be able in NHS England also to access this. But Social Work Scotland are interested in accessing this, particularly Module 4, or potentially we'll make a separate version for them. and the Scottish Prison Service are also interested in a slimmed down version for prison officers. I think if people involved with people in the criminal justice system, the professionals involved have some understanding of head injury and how they can manage it, I think we'll be a long way down the road to improving things. And finally, really, I mentioned before that people with head injury involved in the criminal justice system often really don't know much about head injury. They inadvertently avoid contact with health professionals and so on. They don't know too much about it. So we did develop a single group psychoeducation session, and found that it was effective in improving knowledge across a single session, and that was maintained a month later. And it's important because these people are at risk of future head injury. They need to be aware of that, how to avoid that. It's a low-cost way of providing education. And it would also include these simple strategies for self-management. It might reduce recidivism and improve well-being. So we're going to have content of that on the NEST training system, and we're hoping to develop an online intranet system in the prisons in Scotland, so it could be provided either in a group format or prisoners who are going to education sessions could get it there in the prison intranet. So thanks very much for listening. I hope that was of interest to you. These are, in case people are interested, these are publications. We've done about 20 associated with this work. Thanks.
So as Colin mentioned, I'm Chris Marriott. I'm the Justice Programme Manager for Headway UK. So I manage everything justice related for the charity. So a few of my responsibilities are I manage our brain injury identity card. I also manage our prison, probation and police projects. So it's about 4 projects that I manage altogether. So I'll go through a little bit about each of the projects systematically. So the brain injury identity card, which you can see on the screen here, is something that we issue brain injury survivors. Originally, it was for interaction with the criminal justice system, but we've quickly learned through the years that it helps in everyday life. For instance, when people are using public transport or they're trying to navigate busy supermarkets and things like that, they use it to aid them to explain to staff about their brain injury and why their symptoms might be showing in a certain way. So as you can see there, it has 4 symptoms on the front. And that phone number that you can see there, it's a 24-hour legal assistance helpline for anybody that has interaction with the criminal justice system. That goes through to a solicitors group called Thompson Solicitors, which is a solicitor in our solicitors directory, and they can provide us assistance 24 hours a day nationally, which is really good. Also, with the brain injury identity card, I actually had a meeting yesterday up in Wearside, and a lot of the people that we were speaking to up there who are brain injury survivors say that it gives them their identity and actually proves that they have one. So, you know, the wondering whether they do or whether they don't, this is actual proof that they've got a brain injury, because every person that's issued one of these cards has to prove their brain injury. So whether that's through a doctor's note or previous medical records, in prisons as well. So people in prisons are allowed to apply for these cards just so long as they've given permission to their prison offender manager or the neurodiversity support manager, and they write in an email and say they've specifically seen proof of brain injury, then we're happy to issue for prisons as well, because you have to use a little bit of common sense in those situations, because getting medical records are quite difficult in those circumstances. A few exciting things about the brain injury identity card is we're looking to digitalise the brain injury identity card, which we're hoping will reduce lost identity cards, and it will also give people the ability to share their ID card with a safe person. So for instance, if they are in a criminal justice situation and they're arrested, one of the first things that the police do is take your mobile phone. Also, they may not have their physical ID card on them, but what they can do is they can contact a safe person who can then come down to the police station and provide proof that that person has a brain injury. So like I said, it gives the ability to share. Along with it also, we're trying to adapt the brain injury identity card with certain police regions. And what we're looking to do is when somebody applies from those certain police regions, is they'll fill out a form that will be sent to the local police, and then what the police will do is they'll put it on a crisis and care database. Once it's uploaded to the crisis and care database, they will give us a unique reference number specifically for that person who's applied for the brain injury identity card, and then that will be printed on the brain injury identity card. So if there are any circumstances where police are responding and the person, for instance, is in a crisis situation, they've quoted their URN down the phone, then the police can access specialist information and in-depth information about interactions with that person previously, so they're ready before they actually go on scene. So it gives people more knowledge on arrival on scene of what symptoms a person might be seeing, what triggers them. So this will hopefully reduce the amount of arrests and things towards brain injury survivors. So that's pretty much sat at the information sharing agreement stage, and anyone that's ever been involved in information sharing agreements will know how long they take. I think we're sitting at about the 5-month point at the moment for the information sharing agreement, but hopefully in the near future we'll get that over the line. So that's a few exciting things about the brain injury identity card. Police projects. So we provide training for police, and what we do is we have a specific template of training, which is built around a basic understanding of brain injury, which is approximately 2.5-3 hours long. We can do it in person or via Teams or any other remote method like that. And what we do is we will create the training package and tailor it to the needs of the police region. The second module is about understanding behaviours that challenge and managing behaviours that challenge, and ways to deal with that. So we've got those training packages that are going on as well. Moving on to the prison project, this is probably the most advanced project that we've got at the moment because they had quite a lot of uptake. I've been in position just under a year now, and by the end of April 2026, we should have reached 11 prisons for training staff. So that's really exciting. We've already delivered to HMP Five Wells and HMP Rochester. We have a contract set up through the NHS Foundation Trust in Surrey to train 5 prisons within Surrey. And we're also doing work with Novus, which I'll move a little bit onto in a second. And thereafter, they provide prison education in 53 estates throughout the UK. And they're looking to get all of their staff trained. So we should have reached another 6 prisons within that time. So we should be reaching quite a large number of justice professionals within the 12-month period. So it's really exciting. So the training that we deliver, again, it's all tailored to the prison estate that we're delivering to, and we will build it alongside their neurodiversity support managers for the needs of the staff. You know, for instance, whether prison on prisoner violence is a particular issue, or prison on staff violence, or dependency and recovery issues, drug and substance misuse. We can tailor our approach to the training to cover those subjects a lot more in depth. Another exciting thing, like I mentioned, Novus previously. So what we're looking to do between us and Headway Retail is build a contract with prison industries where we can sell the products that are created and refurbished in prison industries in our retail shops, which will give an end result for the prisoners. Because at the moment, when they, for instance, say they refurbish a table and chair set, just as an example, it will just go into storage and it won't go anywhere. So there's no finalization to the hard work that those people have put in. So what we're hoping to do is give them an end result, and then we will let the prisoner know when it's sold that it has been sold and it's gone to, for instance, an elderly couple that were struggling for a table and chairs. So, you know, it gives the sense of purpose and sense of achievement at the end of the hard work, which is one thing that Novus said that there isn't at the moment. So hopefully we can fix that gap. Moving on to probation. So there are a few probation regions where we're looking at funding opportunities. A lot of the training and stuff like that comes down to funding opportunities, because the beauty of our training is we get specialists in to deliver the training. And obviously you have to pay for their time to make the training as effective as possible. So yeah, there's 2 probation regions at the moment which we're looking to deliver staff training to, and what we're looking to do as well alongside brain injury professionals is build a 5-module rehabilitation course for people with brain injuries leaving prison, adjusting back into society. And that will also be lived experience led as well. So we will have lived experience people within the last 2 modules to help authenticate the training and bring more impact to the training. So these are hopefully going to be being created financial year 2026-2027. So we've got quite a while to start building up and find the right people to build it. So that's pretty much a basic summary of what we're doing within the criminal justice program. A lot of it is centered around education, because the strategy is all pointing towards education of justice professionals. And once we've educated justice professionals, we can start looking at the rehabilitation, especially with inside custody, because there's no point in looking at rehabilitation inside custody if the professionals don't know anything about the people that they're supposed to be supporting. So that is that's the mantra that we're using at the moment for the justice program. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any questions.